My name is Michelle Duchesneau. I'm currently a student at the School of Community Public Affairs. I've spent about 8 years working in community and working particularly with youth and families, working on issues that affect particularly the community of Pointe-Saint-Charles.
My name is Patricia Murphy. Currently I'm a teacher in the social service department at Dawson College. I've been involved in community activism for the past 30 years. I've been involved in movements to support the rights of refugee claimants and refugees here in Canada, and in organizations that support women's rights, and what else? Neighborhood activism, particularly in the community of Pointe-Saint-Charles.
So Patricia, can you tell me, when you were growing up, can you talk about what social movements you observed going on around you?
I guess the one that really caught my attention growing up in the 60s and 70s was the sovereignty movement here in Quebec. It was a very interesting time, a very dynamic time in Quebec, but because I didn't really feel part of it, being an Anglophone. At the time, it really wasn't open to Anglophones, so there was also the sense of fascination with the movement, but also a sense of being excluded from it too. So that was a movement that was very much that influenced my thinking, and certainly after the 1980 referendum, things in my life changed. Many of my friends hit the 401, left Quebec. There was that real sense of paranoia and fear, and a lot of people left, and some of us stayed and realized in staying that we had to make some serious choices and changes in our lives, and one was to learn to speak French, and also to begin to participate in a broader way in the social movements and to find our place here in Quebec. In the early 90s, I worked for an organization called Montreal City Mission, which is still around. It's currently located down at St. James Church on St. Catherine Street. And at the time I was hired, it was to work in a drop-in center for homeless or precariously housed people. It ended up being mainly men that came to the center. And one thing we noticed was that more and more there were newly arrived people coming into the drop-in center that seemed to be mixed in with the population of homeless people, street people, and many of them had just arrived from countries in difficulty. They had arrived following some traumatic experiences, and I began to realize that many of them were refugee claimants that had no recourse to any supports. They were arriving here not knowing what to do, where to go, and we began to meet with them and work with them, and found out that they were indeed here making a refugee claim in Canada and were falling through the cracks. So we started a project to offer temporary housing and support to people who were coming and who needed that. And we ended up opening up Project Refuge, which was a shelter, and eventually, working in consultation with other groups, we opened up a few other organizations, one for women, Refugee Madeleine, and Project Famille at Maison de l'Amitié. So the Maison de l'Amitié became like a hub of these different organizations that were coming together to provide support to this community, and it was great because within a few years there were hundreds of people who would come through Maison de l'Amitié from all parts of the world with a lot of different reasons why they had fled their countries, and there were just these incredible bonds of friendship and community that were established. And we used to have community suppers where everything was translated into 5 languages, and actually 6 with sign language, all by John Doherty, who was really good with languages. And there was just a wonderful synergy and energy that took place there. So that was a really good time. And we're living in very different times now, where recently, well, even just last year, we saw the cuts to the provision of healthcare to refugee claimants, and currently the attempt to remove the obligation of provinces to provide social assistance to refugees. So these are very different times from the ones that we were living in then.
If you had to identify one key date where an important event happened, what would it be?
Maybe 2 key dates. One was, I'm bad with dates, but I think it would have been in June of 2005, and you were part of this, so you could probably let me know if that was the right date. But there was this kind of conglomerate of mega powers in Quebec, everyone from Société du Havre to Cirque du Soleil to governments and others, that had decided without any community consultation or with any impact studies or anything that they were going to move the Ile Notre-Dame casino right into the heart of Pointe-Saint-Charles. And it was kind of like a surprise. And it was presented in such a way that this was going to create jobs and this was going to be good for the community, and nobody was buying that. And there we were basically shut out. This was going to happen, and we were shaking our heads going, I don't think so. And so instead of kind of winding down for not that we ever closed for the summer, but things were a little bit more mollo, we really had to get working on this dossier. And so spent a lot of time doing research of what's happened in other Canadian cities where casinos have moved into the heart of an urban center, and what was that like, and what was the impact. And sure enough, we found in places like Windsor, for example, that yes, there was a big shiny casino in the middle of the town, but all around it was urban decay and poverty and problem gambling and security problems and so on. Everything that we thought would happen here. And so then we had to really start mobilizing people and educating people and consulting people about how they felt about it and what they believed this would bring to the community. And for the most part, there was a pretty general consensus that this would be a disaster for the community of Pointe-Saint-Charles and also for Montreal. So we really resisted it. And so did, it wasn't just when I say we, I mean all of the groups in Pointe-Saint-Charles. And then we also reached out to our networks. We got a petition going where we got 10,000 signatures, and that was by going door to door. And mainly in Pointe-Saint-Charles, but also through the church networks and other networks as well. The day that you asked me was the day when it was announced, which was the day we really got working on this, and it was a good 2 years of really, really hard work, that ended in another date, which was, I think, in June of 2006 or 2007, when we heard that the whole thing had fallen like a house of cards. And what had happened was the government's own studies. At first, they were not going to do any impact studies, and there was a lot of pressure for them to do that. So the Department of Public Health and the Department of Public Security did impact studies, and sure enough, came up with the exact same conclusions that we had arrived at earlier, that this would, have a negative impact on the community health and community security. And so when that happened, Cirque du Soleil pulled out, and when Cirque du Soleil pulled out, as I said, the whole project fell like a house of cards, and we won. So it was a great victory. It was a small community, generally thought of as a low-income, poor community, but a community that's very rich in its ability to organize and mobilize and speak up for its rights. And that community got together and won a really hard-fought battle against some very powerful groups and figures. And we're very proud of that.
Could you tell me what social movements or activities, other than the casino and your work around refugees, do you want to tell me about other movements that you've been involved in? Maybe St. Gabriel's School.
Okay, sure. I don't know if I call it a movement, but it was certainly a citizen based, how can I say, campaign to keep a local community school open in the community of Pointe-Saint-Charles. This is a school that's been around for about 50 years, I guess. 50 years?
I'm not sure.
About that long. And it's a school, it's the last, at the time that they were going to close it, it was the last standing English school in the Southwest, I believe, or in Pointe-Saint-Charles. And it was very, there was a lot of parental involvement, a lot of parent volunteers at the school. And the school reached out to the kids of the community, had services, that were very very much designed for them, and it was a school that the kids walked to, and that was really in the heart of the community, and the community valued it. It was just around the time that I started working at St. Columba House that a group of mothers came to see us and were very distressed about the fact that the school was closing. So again, this is the strength of the community of Pointe-Saint-Charles. People really got together and mobilized, and once again the Action Gardien coalition really helped out, and St. Columba House really supported the parents and helped them to prepare for these hearings. And so these were parent volunteers. They were not used to this process. They weren't sure what they needed to do, but we had to produce a brief and write up all the reasons why we felt it was of value to the community and to the school system to keep the school open. And so we did that. And then the night of the hearings, we had a troop of bagpipers that led us into the school commission, and we had really prepared our delivery of our brief, and we had some media there, and Action Gardien had done a big banner basically saying to keep St. Gabriel's School open. But what happened was when the media arrived, all the parents went and hid behind the banner, and they were really terrified to speak in public about something that they really cared about. However, we did, go through, and we delivered our brief, and they decided by a pretty wide margin to keep the school open. And so we were thrilled. It was great. And we thought St. Gabriel's School is saved. And I think it was just around the time that we were probably finally had organized a victory party. We heard that we were up for closure again. Like within 9 months or something, we were back again. But we realized that this time it couldn't be the community workers that were the ones who were going to be able to save the school this time. It really had to be the parents. So the second time was a lot more interesting because it was much more led by the parents. They had to be the ones to speak. They had to be the ones to deliver this message. They had to be the ones to stand up and talk to the media, and so they did. And there was a long process of working with them, preparing them, doing role plays, brainstorming, having lots of fun. And the second round, they really did a wonderful job. Within I think a year and a half of the first round of closures, or consultations, they managed to save the school for the second time. And you know the rest. It came up again, and now St. Gabriel's is doing fine. Yeah.
Could you tell me about how language played out in the St. Gabriel's citizen?
Well, what was interesting about that was St. Gabriel was an English school. The parents were, for the most part, unilingually English. The Action Gardien coalition is surprisingly unilingually French. There's not that many English speakers on it. But it was really inspiring how much the Francophone groups backed the school. And so I think what was a big success of that initiative was how the community came together. And that's right, I think that's what we were talking about before, that the Pointe-Saint-Charles is such an interesting community in that there really are, there's both English and French represented, but many people are unilingual. But somehow, because it's a neighborhood in which people know each other and where people get together on common issues, people are able to cross that language divide because they have common interests and they have common values and work together in a very collaborative way. So it didn't matter that it was an English school in a predominantly French community. The Action Gardien coalition really backed the school, and the survival of that school really mattered to the entire community. So that's always been a real strength of Pointe-Saint-Charles.
You talk about unilingual Anglophones and Francophone groups, right? So how were they able to support the Anglophone parents?
In a number of different ways. One was just coming to the consultations, helping out with the communications through the community. So I know the clinique communautaire, they had a little van with a megaphone, went around the community and got school buses and encouraged people to get on the bus and come to the school board and stand up for the school. So they really did a lot of mobilization, a lot of work with the media, both in English and French. And then there were some of us who were more or less bilingual who could also, try to help bridge that divide somewhat. So it was great how people came out and people defended the school.
And what about in the community generally? How does language play out?
Well, similarly, when I think of the campaign to block the casino from moving into Pointe-Saint-Charles, definitely there was the participation of both the Anglophone and the Francophone community, and there was a common interest to prevent that from happening, and common values about what was important in the community and what people wanted to preserve in the community, and what was threatened by the move of a casino to the heart of a community like that. So people worked together. There were public assemblies where translation happened, where people just managed to communicate some way, and when there were mobilizations, both communities showed up.
Do you want to share maybe a best memory when it comes to St. Gabe's?
Well, definitely hearing that the parents had, particularly in the second round of consultations, we heard that the school was going to stay open, and the parents really had a sense of ownership of that victory. And we had a party at the Legion. It was great. It was a lot of fun, and that was a highlight. Yeah.
So do you think that social movements today happen the same way that you described with St. Gabriel's, going out and knocking on doors? And
well, I think it's quite different because we have social media today. So I think that, back then getting 10,000 signatures was incredible. Today you could do that in a week with social media, but it's not really the same. I mean, it is, but it's just much easier to communicate and to network now than it was then. So that's definitely an advantage that we have today, that we can communicate so easily. On the other hand, I think people are possibly less active in terms of actually getting out and meeting up face to face and discussing and engaging in concertation and being part of things. So I think that's probably something's been gained and something's been lost.
From your perspective, is language a meaningful aspect of the history of Quebec social movements over the last 50 years? How or how not?
Well, I think it definitely is. Maybe it is less so now than it was, say, 20 or 25 years ago, where there was much more unilingualism. I think these days, anybody who lives and works in Quebec, or any Anglophone who lives and works in Quebec, has to be at least functionally, if not quite, bilingual. I think maybe one thing is maybe not language so much as the way in which the two communities work, and something I've learned a lot from working with groups like Action Gardien, and even for a while with the Little Burgundy Coalition, is that concertation is a much more important part of Francophone community building than it is in the Anglophone community, I think, at least in my own experience. That, and it used to, maybe when I first started engaging, maybe sometimes it frustrated me a little bit because I thought it was a lot of meetings and a lot of sitting around talking, but I realized that's a very, very important part of social movements, that people sit down and consult, collaborate, envision, build a shared vision, and that's what makes a community movement strong.
What would you say that you've learned from your experience working in these various projects?
I guess the most important thing is that things happen when you're able to bring people together to work on things. Like, so one of the questions you had asked earlier was what was maybe my contribution. I think one thing I'm good at is spotting a good partnership. And so when we worked together, a number of groups worked together on refugee issues in Montreal, it was really great when all of us came together under like Maison de l'Amitié, under the hub of the Mennonite House of Friendship, and I really saw how different people have different strengths, different groups have different approaches, but when you work together, it's quite incredible how much can get done. I know that sounds very cliche, but that's what I would say.
What motivated you to become involved in these different projects?
I guess a real sense of being drawn to groups that were trying to create social change, really. My first experience was at Auberge Madeleine. I was really inspired by the way this collective of women were reaching out to other women and finding ways to support them and empower them, and I was very, very much inspired by that, and it just kind of led me in that direction to continuously search for places where people gathered to think about how we could make our society a better place, more inclusive place, and a place where people's rights and ability to participate in the issues that affected their lives and find some way of having a voice and making change. I just kept finding myself drawn to that.
So you mentioned that you're a teacher at Dawson,
Mm-hmm.
at Dawson College. Do you think that your teaching influenced the way that you work, or vice versa? That you're
Definitely, my social activism, my involvement in community movements it influences my teaching. I mean, that's what I teach.
Mm-hmm.
I'm teaching community organizing. I'm teaching social welfare and legislation classes, and I feel that I bring a lot of experience and history and kind of war stories to the classroom, and I hope to inspire students to get involved as well.
What advice do you have for social movement activists to
Get rid of your car, walk, join things, go to demonstrations, go to events that are happening that help you learn more about what's going on in your community and how you can have a voice in it. And I think in my teaching, I really try to do that, try to get students out of the classroom into the real world and at least witness what's going on and what they might be able to be part of. And I think, get away from the TV, get out of the car, and go where things are really happening. That's what I would say.